Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Paul Street Journal. Today's episode will be on the economic principles of the Old Testament. And I want to make a note before we get started on that. Today's episode may be one that you watch more than once, and it may be a good thing to do so because we're going to be laying groundwork for understanding Catholic social teaching with the Old Testament and through the Old Testament. And what we mean by that is that we're going to be presenting principles, economic principles that we find in the Old Testament that are extremely relevant and very connected to current Catholic social teaching on economics. And I have a question about why we're doing principles, why we're covering principles and not the laws themselves, because we know that the Old Testament has a bunch of laws, but we're presenting principles. So I'm going to ask Brian, first of all, how you doing, Brian?
Good morning. Doing well. How about you, Freddy?
I'm good. Thanks, Brian. So the question I have for you is, why are we presenting principles, economic principles, when we know that there are laws of the Old Testament that may be much more specific than the principles that we'll be covering?
Because there's too many laws.
Okay.
There's 613 laws. Many of them are economical. We just don't have the time to discuss each economic law in the Old Testament. So instead of spending time on, let's say, like 100 economic laws, we're just going to spend time in this episode on 7 principles that we are deducing from the many, many economic laws that are in the Old Testament.
Okay. Yeah, and would we say that these laws are connected to what we practice today? I mentioned already that I said that they're relevant, but my question is, how so?
Very relevant. So any Catholic teaching, whether that's a sacramental teaching or economic teaching, there's a process for the way in which we believe in what we believe. It all starts with Scripture, and all Scripture starts with the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. So we start with that, and then we try to understand, how does Jesus fulfill all of these Old Testament teachings and laws. And then once we understand how Jesus fulfills it, then we have to ask the question, okay, well, how do we apply that to today, right? And the church and the church magisterium, or the teaching authority of the church, helps us discern that. But it all starts with the Old Testament.
Okay, yeah, and principles. We're gonna make it easy to consume, because I'm sure if we let you could talk for hours, and if you did, I would have a million questions.
Yes.
But the principles will make it a little bit easier to understand and to digest, to connect to what comes after.
There's different levels of intensity with this subject. So I've spent 10 years on this one episode for our podcast, and I did write a book about it. And Thomas Aquinas, who joins us in this collection called the Summa, he spends a lot of time on this too. He takes all of the 613 laws of the Old Testament, and he divides them into thirds.
Okay.
A third of which are perhaps in some way connected to economics.
Okay. I mean, hopefully we can make more shout outs to Thomas later on in the podcast too. It sounds exciting. So with those notes kind of out of the way, let's get started. Let's jump right in. So we have 7 economic principles, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So break it down. What's the first one?
So the first one we're calling private property and locational stability. Now, in the Israelite culture, in Judaism, perhaps the most important gift that the Jewish people received, that the Israelites received from God, was the land itself, the promised land. So this land, gifted by God, it was not earned at all by the people. They conquered it by miraculous circumstances that are outlined in the book of Joshua primarily. And once the land was conquered, the land was given to all Israelite families, households, through a tribal system, but Joshua, acting on behalf of God, apportioned this land to all of the Israelites. The Israelites, as a result, they took that land very seriously. They were not allowed to sell it according to Jewish law. If they lost it for any reason, it had to be given back to them every 50 years under the law of Jubilee. So in addition to this private property that they were responsible for, there was also this concept of locational stability. So families would occupy the same land for many, many generations, hundreds of years. And the expectation is that it was a rather large property. There were sometimes multiple houses on the property and multiple generations living on the property. And there were many goods that resulted from this. So employment was assumed for anybody who lived there. They were all given their own role in the household. And oftentimes this was agrarian, like a farming sort of context. Childcare was a part of it, with many, many people. Certain people handled farming, other people handled childcare. Education was involved, done on the property. Elderly care. So like today, now we have government doing all of these things for us, right? But back then, with locational stability and private property, it was all done right there, like within the family. Okay. If there were disabled people, if that applied, that was a part of it. And even care for the environment. Just imagine that all property was private and owned by the people who lived on it. Would people take care of it?
Probably.
Most likely. And they would care for the environment, not just for their current situation, but for future generations, which was their own family.
Okay. I have a question that I'm probably going to ask for every principle, so it might get annoying, but I think it'll be good for the listeners and for me to understand. In the first episode, I asked you for your definition of economics, and you started to connect it to the Greek root. So my question is basically going to be for each principle: why is our locational stability, why is our property, why is where we are economic? How is that related to the definition you gave? It's a great question. In an agrarian economy, land is perhaps the primary resource. So all economic goods, in many ways, start with the land. Land equaled money back then, because it was the land that produced food, and it was food that as we'll see in future principles here, it was food that generally ran the whole economy. Okay. Many people don't know this, but the oldest Jewish coin ever minted was in the year 70 BC. Wow. So what besides foreign currency, what was the resource that was traded in the Israelite economy? It was primarily food, like farming products. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, I see. So if you don't have property, you don't really have resources before currency exists, right?
Right. And the expectation from the very beginning is that every family had property.
Okay, I see. Got it. Thank you. Yeah. So we can jump to the second principle, which is
freedom of discernment.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, I think a lot of Christians look at the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, as full of rules that are very specific. It tells you what to do, when to do it, and that's generally true. So the Old Testament economic laws sometimes are very specific, and one example of that is the temple tax. So this was a half shekel that was owed by every Israelite male annually who was over the age of 20 years old. Okay. So that's very specific. Who has to pay the tax, how much needs to be paid, and where does the temple tax go? What does it fund? The temple. And before the temple, the meeting tent at Shiloh, right? So that's very specific. Other examples of specific laws the first, second, and third tithes, right? But in other laws that are economical in the Old Testament, there was a lot of freedom, and it was not so specific. So are you familiar with this corner crop?
I think I've learned a bit about it, yeah.
Yeah. So during harvesting time, let's say you were harvesting this big field of barley. Well, the Old Testament requires that every Israelite farmer leave a corner of it unharvested, so that that little area could be harvested by the poor, by widows, or by aliens or foreigners, whatever, sojourners, right? There's many words for that. But how much did the farmer have to leave of that corner unharvested? The Bible doesn't say. So the Israelite farmer had to choose for him or herself, right? So that's this idea of freedom of discernment. Another example is almsgiving. So every Israelite was obligated to give money or to the poor, to give food to the hungry, to give housing to the homeless, even to find a wife for an unmarried man. All of that counted as almsgiving. It's kind of funny, right? So how much, though? Does the Bible say how much every Israelite had to give in alms? No. The Israelite farmer had to choose. So this freedom of discernment basically allowed local Israelites to take a survey of the needs of their community, and using their best judgment to give according to what the needs were within their local area, all in the context of their own needs for themselves and for their families.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, a question comes to my mind, and I think you almost answered it fully at the end there. So when I think about discernment, I also think about not necessarily accountability, but some sort of metric of goodness. Like I have the freedom to discern how much I'm going to leave, but in my own heart, let's say I would like to make it a good amount, an amount that whoever it may be, God or my family members, are proud of. This may be a big question, but was there any sort of metric? And that's why I say you almost answered it by.
It's a fair question. I like it, and I think that we would agree. Most people would agree that freedom often comes with responsibility, right? So when an Israelite farmer is free to decide how much to give in alms, he or she also needs to realize that they're responsible for those who are poor in their local region, right? So there's a connection between freedom and responsibility. Now, scribal law, long after the Old Testament laws were written, started giving guidelines.
Okay.
So that was another form of accountability.
Yeah.
Right. So if you read the Bible, there's no specifics, but if you read the Talmuds, like the Babylonian Talmud, it'll say like Israelites should be giving at least 10% in alms annually.
Okay.
Right. Corner crop should be a 40th, a 50th, or a 60th, depending on how generous you want to be.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for number 2. Number 3 is
economic acts as worship.
Okay.
So I think that most people in the 21st century American context would separate their economic decisions, purchases, sales, job choices. They would separate those from worship. But one of the most important things to glean from all of the Old Testament laws is that your economic decisions and your worship of God are not separate, but synthesized. They're the same. So this is just beaten into people's minds in Old Testament law in a good way, in a good way. So every economic law in the Old Testament is done in the context, firstly, of thanksgiving to God. Now, what did God give the Israelites? Well, we already talked about the land being a primary gift. The law, there's this great appreciation for the law, that God gives them, that guides their life and brings joy to them. Protection from foreign enemies. And Israel is in the middle of two giant enemies, the Assyrians to the north and the Egyptians to the south, and even the Philistines within their own homeland, right? Thanksgiving for a good harvest. All of these economic acts, they were always done with thanksgiving. And even in Eucharist today, when the priest is doing the consecration, right? It's all in the context of thanksgiving, right? That's what Eucharist means, thanksgiving. So, I'm rambling, sorry, but how at a table, if we were all to have a meal together, we would just say grace. We'd say, thank you, God, for all this stuff. But what's the Jewish way of doing it? All right, there's the bread. We're going to say, thank you, God, for the bread. Now there's the wine. We're going to say, thank you, God, for the wine.
Yeah.
There's the bitter herbs. We're going to thank you. Every dish gets its own prayer of thanksgiving, right? Okay. So that I think we need to really understand as we get into economics, this synthesis of thanksgiving with every economic act.
Yeah. You mentioned this already towards the beginning of that, that it doesn't feel like that's the case today. That you said that there's kind of this separation between our economic, our financial life, and our worship life. But we mentioned earlier in the episode that there is a connection from Catholic social teaching today to these principles, and it feels like it needs to get fleshed out. Like we need to draw that out quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it might take us years to do this, but today we start with Old Testament, then we go to New Testament next episode, and then we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I just have one more thing to say
Yes,
about this one. So, most economic laws in the Old Testament had a very specific prayer attached to it. So the priests were basically 1/12 of the Israelite people, and they did not get land. They did not work the farms. They were given cities to occupy, and were totally dependent on economic gifts from the rest of the Israelite farming population.
Okay.
So they received in total 24 gifts, and one of them was first fruits. So first fruits was seven specific species that every farmer needed to bring in a basket all the way to Jerusalem, and they gave it to the priests, usually in the spring every year. And as the priests received that gift, they would all recite a specific psalm, Psalm 30, right? So many of the economic laws in the Old Testament, there's always a specific prayer attached. And just one more example of economic acts and worship always being synthesized.
Yeah, I see. Aside from the freedom of discernment from some of the laws, it sounds like a lot of economic practice and worship was kind of prescribed. Like they were told what to do in the Israelite economy. Almost sounds like I want something like that, I want less freedom to discern.
I understand. Yeah, the clarity is wonderful, but in the next episode, we're going to talk about the cost of that clarity.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So that wraps up number 3. And I also want to note that those first 3 that we covered, private property and locational stability, freedom of discernment, and economic acts as worship, we have separated those into their own category, being the individual category of the 7, and then the next 4 are going to be of the societal category that we've created. And the first of the societal category is human solidarity.
Yes. So solidarity, let me just try to define that.
It sounds good luck.
I'm going to go online. So individuals sharing a common interest, mutual support within a group. So there's this idea of societal oneness in the healthy sense, right? So the Old Testament is obsessed with 3 types of people: the poor, widows, and foreigners, or aliens, or sojourners, or travelers. And early on in the Bible, Genesis chapter 4, Cain, who kills his brother, he asks God a very important question. Am I my brother's keeper? And even though Cain doesn't get a direct answer, the rest of the Bible gives the answer, for hundreds of years. And the answer is a resounding yes. We are all our brother's keeper. And of course, the scribe asks Jesus in the New Testament, but who is my brother? And what does Jesus say? He gives the parable of the Good Samaritan, a foreigner actually helping out an Israelite, talking about that kind of brotherhood, or that type of neighborhood, right? So this idea of human solidarity and human oneness and caring for other human beings, it's not a Christian concept first, it's a Jewish concept first. Now, Jesus is going to take it to the next level, redefining neighbor and brother, but it all starts with Judaism and with the Israelite religion, where God does not just care about the Israelites only in the Old Testament. God cares about every sort of person. Every human being walking the planet is loved by God. And as a result, Israelites in the Old Testament are to care for the travelers traveling through from the north to the south and so forth through the trade routes. And so there's this idea of responsibility for others, even if they're not a part of your quote unquote tribe.
I see. Okay. I have I think my own thought, which leads to a bigger question. So for my understanding of Old Testament and Israelites of that time, excuse me, it seems that there's tension with certain groups, whether that's, groups that had conquered Israelite land or foreigners like the Samaritans.
Yes.
Maybe like a healthy tension, or it sounds like there is tension. So I'm wondering how that tension fits into this principle of human solidarity, specifically in the Old Testament, because you already mentioned that Jesus kind of redefines neighbor.
Yeah, that's a good question. So your question was very focused on the foreigner, the traveler coming through. So the big trade route in between the giant superpowers of Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south was along the sea of the Mediterranean Sea, like in Israel. So that there were foreigners traveling through Israel all the time, right? And sometimes they'd fall on hard times, and these laws helped them. The expectation was that they were traveling through, though. Like when a group of people tried to settle in the land of Israel, that was basically an act of war, right? Like the Philistines or whatever. So now how does this apply in today's context? We're going to talk about this. We're going to spend entire episodes just on immigration, which is a major economic question today.
Yeah, certainly.
And the question itself, it changes greatly just depending on the location and the time. So like we're in the United States right now where nearly everybody is an immigrant. Whether they're second or third generation is kind of besides the point. It's a nation of immigrants. So how do we act? But it's just important to know the history in regards to immigration when it comes to human solidarity and so forth. The principle that we need to focus on for now is the fact that every person walking the planet belongs to and is loved by God, and we are to see each individual in that light.
Okay, got it. That's a great answer. Thanks. So that's number 4 altogether. The next principle, which fits into the societal category, is supporting communal worship.
Yeah. Society supporting communal worship is an Old Testament principle that, again, seems foreign to us today. But nonetheless, it remains a fact that this is central in many of the laws of the Old Testament. So the priests and their families, like I said, they survived off of 24 different types of gifts in the Old Testament. Worship spaces were supported by laws that applied to everybody. Even worship events were covered by the society, right? So in the Republic era, following the Industrial Revolution, we believe in today in like the separation of church and state, but back then, no one may have even thought of such an idea, and society investing financially in communal worship was assumed. So no matter how important that is for us today, we're recognizing that it's a major principle in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Okay. And for the most part, from what we've discussed already, it sounds like those laws that supported communal worship were ones that were a bit more specific. Am I right about that? Or
yeah. So I think many people are aware of like the Old Testament first tithe, which supported priests, but very few people know about the second tithe, which was you taking as a farmer 10% of your crop after fulfilling all sorts of other laws first, taking that next 10% and bringing it with your family to Jerusalem and eating that second tithe in a celebratory meal within the city walls of Jerusalem, right? So that's basically an Old Testament law that applies to all farmers to fund partying, feasting and celebration meals in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I see. So. And another thing that I think about is you've already mentioned also the Mass today in a Catholic church. We have the offertory, and we have the basket that comes by, and us putting whatever we can into the basket. But even to jump back to that point we already made, that still feels a little bit separate from our entire financial life, I guess. Like,
yes.
That is us putting part of our financial life into the basket to support the church. But it feels separate still. So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about this more in the next episode.
Okay.
But
I'm sure we will.
But it's foreign concept for us. But back then, this idea of the people as a whole supporting the priests and the worship of the community central.
Okay, got it. So that is the fifth principle. The next principle is hierarchy and subsidiarity. And I think this sounds like it's two principles, but we have it as one. So could you unpack that?
These are two different words, obviously, but we've been doing that with all the principles, right?
I guess,
because we're just trying to cram stuff in. But the way I see these two words is two sides of one coin.
Okay.
And one can't exist without the other. So hierarchy, I think we all know what that is. Subsidiarity is maybe you're less familiar with it, but my short definition of it is local government is the best and most efficient kind of government. All right. So, and it seems subsidiarity right now it's like an option for how governments act, but in ancient times it was required. Nobody had a choice but to live this way. So this principle is deduced from observation and insight in regards to the way things were versus the way things are today. So an example of subsidiarity and how it works the first tithe in the Old Testament is a good example. So the way first tithing works is a farmer takes 10% of his crop and has to give it to the priestly class. So in a subsidiarity environment, the farmer takes that 10% of his crop, which is a ton of food. Just imagine you have like dozens and dozens of acres. 10% of a crop of that size would be a huge amount of food to transport. So the priests lived scattered throughout the land of Israel, occupying 48 cities scattered throughout the nation. So an Israelite farmer having a ton of food to move would then move it to the closest of those 48 Levite cities. And then he was done.
Okay.
And then the Levites themselves would take 10% of that the tithe of the tithe, and they would give that to the capital in Jerusalem. Now, just imagine if they didn't practice subsidiarity, and if they practiced like a central government model. Like, let's pretend how that would work. Every Israelite farmer, no matter, even if they lived 100 miles away, they'd have to take 10% of their giant crop and somehow transport that 70 to 100 miles to Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem would take the correct portions and give it to the local Levite cities. That would have, moving that size of a crop all that distance would have been impossible. You would have needed trains, like locomotives, 18-wheeler trucks, right? There's no way that could have happened. So back in the time of the Old Testament, subsidiarity was a necessity. It starts local, and then it goes to the central government. Now, think about how healthy this is, right? Because we also are talking about hierarchy. So the food starts at the farm, then it moves to the priest, then from the priest to Jerusalem. It goes up the ladder, right? Now, if the central government, like in Jerusalem, isn't acting well, you could see what's happening here. Maybe those local governments won't give the national government what it deserves. Right? So there's this idea of like accountability. The local regions are holding the national government accountable. So that sort of regionalism, local first, big government second, right? That is healthy, right? Yeah. So that's why we call this one principle, because hierarchy and subsidiarity, they kind of go together and they depend on one another.
Yeah.
The hierarchy is funded by the local.
Yeah, it makes sense. You explained that very well. The question I have is that, were there moments in the Old Testament where that was the case, where the central government was, not acting?
Oh yeah, it happens all the time.
Okay. So then the smaller governments don't give.
Yes. Okay. So we see that the nation of Israel breaks in half soon after David's reign, and that's tragedy. But then there's reforms. And there's reunifications, and sometimes it seems that the subsidiarity environment is broken, and everything goes straight to Jerusalem and is very centralized, right? So, there's definitely messiness in the Old Testament.
I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. So that does it for number 6. And number 7, and our last principle, also a societal one, is seasons and holidays.
Does this sound like economics to you?
No, not really.
Well, it is. Because don't forget that economics, a huge part of that is labor. And a huge part of labor is time off, vacations, holidays. Our word in English, holiday, comes from the holy day. This idea of taking time off to worship, not just to rest, but to worship, because worship and rest were the same thing to the ancient Israelites. So when it comes to labor in an agrarian society, there was a rhythm to life, to worship, and to economics, and it all centered around the harvest, right? So think about the name of the first month of the year for the Jewish people is called Abib, which means ripe harvest, right? So everything was centered around harvest, produce, and that was the economic system. So there were times for work, there were times for rest, there were holy days, aka holidays, aka vacation.
Nice.
So every Israelite would receive one day off per week, which was Saturday, the Sabbath, the Shabbat. They would take about 3 weeks off per year, because there were 3 7-day festivals that most tried to get to in Jerusalem. Most bar mitzvahed boys would go with their dads to Jerusalem at a minimum, right? And it was common for a 12-year-old to take a trip 1 year before the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, and that's what Jesus did, by the way. in the Gospel of Luke. He goes as a 12-year-old as like a trial run.
Yeah.
And then every Israelite human being, animal, and even the land rested 1 year of every 7. So the Israelite economy ran on 7-year cycles called septennates. And you would work, the people, animals, the land would work for 6 years and would take a sabbatical, a 7th year off. So working at Seton Hall, when a professor is working for like 10 years and then wants to take a sabbatical, I say, no, the sabbatical is every 7 years. But they don't care about what I have to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, you explained that really well. I think it didn't sound, or it doesn't sound economic, but I think you paint the picture very, very well.
It's economic in the sense that it's labor, rest, holidays.
Yeah, I get that.
Sense.
Yeah. I when I first see the word, I think seasons, and we're talking about like an agricultural economy. I guess for me, seasons sounds like it's related to the harvest and, when it's time to harvest. And that did sound a little economic, but holidays didn't so much.
Yeah, this is also the seasons word that I chose here is an ode to Moses Maimonides, who is Thomas Aquinas' contemporary-ish, but he was the great mind of that time in the Jewish faith. Right? And he has a book, one volume of his giant treatise like this is called the Book of Seasons, where we get many of the order of the economic laws of the Old Testament. So he's a major source of the material today.
I see. Okay, good to know. I mean, well, that does it for the 7 principles that we have. Do you have anything else that you want to make a note of?
Just one last thing. So Jesus was Jewish, correct?
Yes.
All 12 of his apostles were Jewish.
Yes.
And that odd 13th apostle, Paul, he was Jewish too, was he not?
Yeah, he was.
And they never renounced their Judaism. So I think a lot of types of Christians today think of Christianity as this departure from Judaism, a rejection of Judaism. But that's not right. Catholicism is the fulfillment of the continuation of Judaism, right? So as Catholics, we're not ignoring the Old Testament. We are embracing the Old Testament. We love the wisdom of it, what it has to tell us, and we work with that. And Jesus is such a principled person, not so much into the laws themselves, but in these principles. So he's going to fulfill these principles in our next episode.
Yeah.
So without studying the Old Testament background of economics, understanding Jesus is going to be either difficult or impossible. So this is an important step that we're making today.
Yeah, I see. Okay, that's a nice foreshadow to episode 3 then. But yeah, I mean, I think that does it for today. If I want to mention that Brian has written a book on these kinds of topics. It's called The Divine Economy, a Catholic explanation of tithing and stewardship. And if you want to take a deeper dive after listening to this episode or for whatever reason you may want to, I have read through it myself. I think it's great. I think it explains these things in a very digestible way. So that's just my little pub for Brian's book. Episode 3, like we mentioned, is going to be on the New Testament fulfillment of these principles. So make sure you're keeping an eye out. And to do so, make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you're on YouTube, please do drop a like and hit the bell for notifications. While you're at it, make sure to check out the other shows produced by the Diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon, hosted by Bishop Kevin Sweeney and Jay Agnish, and Coffee with Cupkey, hosted by Monsignor Raymond Cupkey and Father Paul Manning. I also want to give a special thanks to Joe Ginexi and Caitlin Ferrari, who are the production team that make this show what it is. And with all that said, I just want to say thank you again for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.